Okay, good to have you out today. Glad none of you were snowed in, but it is refreshing to look up on the side of the mountain and see the snow up there. Yeah, and just to see the mountains refreshing too, huh? Okay, we're in the book of Daniel. You can be turning there, but first let's open with a word of prayer. Our gracious Father, once again, we just marvel at your tender, fatherly, loving care that is shown to us on a daily basis. We thank you that you just pour out upon us one billowing wave of grace upon another, and help us to not be so glutted that we just somehow take it for granted, or we somehow think because of our goodnesses that you had to do it to us. This is all of your grace, and we marvel at it and thank you. And thank you that you were pleased at the time of creation to set aside a day to specifically devote it to individual as well as corporate worship of you. And we thank you that we live in a country where we have such a privilege and freedom to gather like this and to worship you. And even in the midst of some of these recent circumstances and all, we pray for wisdom and help so that we will be wise in our social interactions, but at the same time, we're trusting your sovereign direction of all these things to keep us safe and to minister to us and to meet the needs of the church family. We thank you specifically today for your word and this book of Daniel. We ask, as always, for the Holy Spirit to be our teacher, that you will guide us and direct us in very clear and definite ways, and may Jesus get all the glory, in whose wonderful name we pray. Amen. Okay, have been in the book of Daniel for a while, and so we are coming toward the end, Lord willing, today, and then two more Sundays should finish it off. And we are in Daniel chapter 11, and the last 2 weeks ago, actually, because last week we had the special promotion. So 2 weeks ago, we were in Daniel 11, picking up at verse 21. Let me give just a real quick summation because we're kind of in the middle of this paragraph, and then we want to move on. It's good to have several new people with us, so hopefully this can be a little bit of a summation as well for them. Remember, we said that Daniel chapters 10 to 12 is a unit in the book. Okay, it is one big unit, um, and as we come to chapter 11, in chapter 11, where we actually have the vision that is given to Daniel, we saw beginning with verse 5 down to verse 20, this very interesting section talking about the king of the north and the king of the south. And of course, there are no names, personal names given, but a really important thing to remember is Daniel is having this vision back in about 537, 536. And what he is seeing is actually going to be, well, the first verses of chapter 11 dealt with Alexander the Great, who reigned from 336 to 323 and expanded the empire bigger than previous ones. But then when he died, four generals were assigned the area that had been his area. And one of them was up here more in Asia Minor, another one over here, etc. But the two that really come into play in the biblical account and in chapter 11, the king of the north, that is the one who inherited this area up here around Syria. And as we've seen, this is the ruler, or these are the rulers who are called the Seleucids. Seleucids, Seleucids. The king of the south is a reference to those who, the general of Alexander who inherited down here in Egypt, and those are the ones we call the Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic dynasty. Okay, so from chapter 11, verses 5 to 20, it simply is talking about all these interactions between the king of the north and the king of the south. And the amazing thing, remember, this is the intertestamental period. This is from 323 down into the 160s. And Daniel is seeing this hundreds of years ahead of time. And as we said, liberal critics, or those who are non-Bible believers, like to look and they say, well, actually, we're supposed to date the book of Daniel way down here because he's writing history. There's no way in the world he could have so explicitly told us what all these kings were going to do and all this political jockeying. But of course, as we know, predictive prophecy is valid, and that's one of the things throughout the Word of God we find where God says, that's how you know I am the true God, because as we say, for lack of a better term, everything is one eternal present to God. He doesn't see something as back here and then here, and oh, this political person did this. Now, how am I going to respond to him? To God, everything is just like right in front of his eyes at the very moment. So God knew exactly what these people were going to be doing with their human freedom, and yet he was sovereignly ruling and overruling to the accomplishment of his purposes. So this is an incredible section that we're on, dealing with this intertestamental period and God's laying out for us exactly what is going to happen. Now, as we said, that in this final section, when we pick up in 11:21 to the end to 11:45, 11:21 begins with, "And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, a contemptible person, a despicable person." And as we saw as we were walking through these, this is a reference to none other than this individual called Antiochus IV, and he named himself, or he gave himself the nickname Epiphanes. Epiphanes means illustrious one or the manifest one. And as we know from history, because remember, we're here in the church age, so we have the privilege of being able to look back at this and understand this more clearly. And we realize, or we see, that the reason he called himself that was because he viewed himself as God manifest. In other words, he wanted people to worship him. Okay? And so in verses 21 to 36, we find this, 21 to 35, we find this individual, Antiochus, and we'll come back to him here in just a second. But then beginning with verse 36 of chapter 11, it says, "And the king shall do according to his will." And as we will see when we get there later today or next Sunday, that is actually appears to be a new individual that is being introduced to us, and that is the personage that we call the Antichrist. And so technically, between verses 35 and 36 in our Bibles, there is literally a gap of more than 2,000 years, because verse 35 ended talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Verse 36 begins by talking about the Antichrist, and the Antichrist, as we know, is even after us. If we're right here in the church age, this little doohickey of a sign usually means the rapture. Then we have the 7-year tribulation, and the Antichrist will be coming along in here. And so that's why from the time of the cross till now, 2,000 years have passed, more than 2,000 years. So that's why between verses 35 and 36, there seems to be this gap of a couple thousand years. And verse 36 begins with, "And the king." And of course, you can say, well, how do we know that the king is different than the vile person of verse 21? Well, it's because when we get to what is going to be spoken of in verses 36 following, generally even liberal historians will say there is no way in the world that was fulfilled with Antiochus. In other words, what is being talked about in the final 10 verses or so of this chapter was not true of Antiochus. It has to be somebody who's even more blasphemous than him, believe it or not. And that's why, as we say, Antiochus is really a type of the Antichrist. And the one quote I put on your sheet there was simply, basically, you take what he does here and you write it in more capital letters, if you will, and you have what the Antichrist is going to be like down here. So these two individuals, well, for sure, the Antichrist is probably the most evil human individual in history. But when you put both of them together, we're talking about, with Antiochus, probably somebody who could vie for one of the top 10 positions of being one of the most evil people ever in the history of the world. So as I title this section at the top, these are two incredibly evil men. But what we definitely need to remember is they are on a long leash. And the point I'm making there is, as we have seen and will continue to see in this segment, it constantly, even as it talks about their incredible evil, it constantly reminds us, but there is an end. There is a time when this will stop. And that's all because they will be limited in what they can do. God allows them, and sometimes you wonder, why did God give them that much leash to do that much evil? God has his purposes, as we will see. But God is in absolute control, even with these two incredibly evil individuals. So that's kind of by way of review to get us up to speed here from a couple of weeks ago. Now, if you will go to about verse 28, this is about where we want to pick up. And just prior to this, in verses 25 to 28, or 25 to 27, we saw Antiochus's Egyptian campaign. As you see on your sheet there, about halfway down by the hole punch, we know from history this actually occurred in about 170 to 169, where Antiochus, remember, he is a Seleucid ruler, so he's up here in Syria, and he came down and he attacked Egypt to try and take over more power and more land, etc. And we realize that in some ways he was sort of frustrated, so it says that he sat down with Ptolemy the Sixth, the king of the south, and as they sat at this peace table, supposedly, they just lied through their teeth to each other, and both of them knew the other one was lying, and yet that's the way a lot of political diplomacy is. You're lying, etc., and you think you're somehow calling the bluff on the other, but he knows you're lying, and it's just crazy, okay? And so we find that when Antiochus left that peace table and had to go home, verse 28 says, then shall he return into his land with great riches. So he's heading back north, somewhat defeated. But now this is the key. His heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he will do exploits and return to his own land. Okay, Antiochus returned home, even though he had a lot of riches. The very fact, we said, by suspending his campaign here in the south, it was really an admission, if you will, that he was somewhat defeated. And so as he went home, somebody's got to be the object of his incredible anger. And as that verse reminds us, it was the holy people. It was the Jews and it was Jerusalem. And so therefore, we know again from history, he ransacked the temple. He basically stripped the temple, took all the objects, etc. Now remember, this is not the worst time. The very next verses are going to talk about an even more blasphemous time. But he did all these things as he was heading home. And so the quote I put on your sheet there is a good summation at this time. It is here that the clash between Antiochus and the faith of Israel begins on a serious level. In other words, there have been problems over the last couple hundred years between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and Palestine. The children of Israel, the Jews, have been bearing kind of the brunt of it as these armies have gone through the land. But this is where the line is really going to be drawn in the sand now. Okay, are you going to stand up for the Jews, be faithful to the covenant of the fathers, or are you going to capitulate and go along with Hellenization, Antiochus' plan, etc.? So verses 29 to 31, we come to Antiochus's Egyptian campaign, what I simply called the sequel. I mean, don't all movies today have a sequel to them? So it's got to be Rocky 1, 2, and if that was really good, Rocky 3, whatever. I mean, I'm not a moviegoer, but I mean, you always see advertised sequels. Well, that's basically what this is. And this we know from history actually was 1 to 2 years later. So let's read verses 29 to 31. At the time appointed, he shall return. So he is Antiochus the fourth, is going to return, and he's going to go south. Okay, so keep this map in your mind. At the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. So immediately we are instructed here that when he returns back to Egypt this time to fight, the outcome of it is going to be different than when he seemed to be having the upper hand and being able to take more control. 4, verse 30, the ships of Kittim shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do, he shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Okay, what's going on here? Well, because of his insatiable greed, he heads to Egypt again, but as we said, there are going to be different results. And why are there different results? Verse 30, because of the ships of Kittim that come. Who is this? These are Roman forces. Okay, now remember, this is about 170 BC 169 BC that we're talking about, okay? And so the Roman Empire over here, or the Romans, shall I say, are beginning to rumble. Technically speaking, or the way historians look at it, it's usually about 63 BC when we say the Roman Empire took over, but the Romans are starting to exhibit a lot of strength, etc., over here with victories. And so the Romans have come over to Egypt to side with the Egyptians or the Ptolemies to stand against Antiochus the Fourth. Okay? And so it says, the ships of the Romans shall come against him, therefore shall he be grieved and return. It's interesting how God summarizes it so simply, because this is the time when, as Antiochus was down there and he met the Roman ambassador, the Roman general drew a circle around him in the sand and said, before you step out of the sand, tell us if you're going to continue to fight or if you'll put your tail between your legs and go home as a defeated army general. Some of you are military guys, okay? Think of what it would be like if you would be a military general. Let's just say let's put in modern countries for the fun of it, okay? Let's just say you would be an American military general, the top ruler over U.S. Middle Eastern forces, and you would be in Iraq, Iran, somewhere, and you'd meet the enemy, and while you're standing there talking, they drew around a sand around you as the U.S. #1 general in that part of the world and said, before you step out of the circle, tell us, are you going to keep fighting or are you going to withdraw your troops and go back to America? Would you stand there and puff out your chest and say, but you don't realize I'm the general? Look at all these fancy things I have hanging here. And that'd be humiliating, right? Well, that is exactly what happened to Antiochus here. And he realized, you know what? I better not try and take on Rome, okay? So he put his tail, again, I'm using common expressions for defeat, humiliation. He put his tail between his legs and he heads home. Now, that really explains why we see what we see here in the rest of these, especially these next couple of verses, okay? What does it say? He is grieved and he will return and have indignation against the Holy Covenant. What's the Holy Covenant a reference to? The Jews, Jerusalem, everything that has to do with Judaism. Somebody's going to bear the brunt of it, and if he can't defeat the Romans and show his power, somebody is going to know he's really the top dog, that he really has some power to him. And so this is when he went into Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is right there, basically toward the top of the Dead Sea. So he went into Jerusalem, and indeed, as verse 31 basically shows us, I mean, he's operating like somebody who is berserk. He's operating like somebody who is literally a madman. And of course, that's actually why some of his enemies said, your name isn't Epiphanes, it is Epimanes. A play on the word Epimanes means you are a madman. And in reality, that's, shall we say, pretty much the way he was showing himself here as he headed home. So, at the end of verse 30, it says, he shall even return and have intelligence with them who forsake the holy covenant. We're not exactly sure who is being referred to here. I mean, it's definitely referring to Hellenized Jews, that he is going to have intelligence with those who are forsaking legitimate Judaism, but it could be that it's also referring to those who are following the illegitimate high priest, a man by the name of Menelaus. Because if you remember last time, we talked about how in previous years, as he's going through here, he is paying off, or the priesthood is paying off him, etc., and he's helping to put the high priest on the throne. And if the high priest wants to stick with Judaism, he says, no way, we don't need you as the priest anymore. I want a priest who's going to tell the Jews they should act like the Greeks, etc., etc. And so it could be here that it's simply reminding us, because again, we know from history that he was in cahoots with the Jewish high priest at that particular time. He is getting the, should we say, chief religious spiritual leader to drink his Kool-Aid, to buy into his process of Hellenization. And so verse 31, wow, one simple verse, but this is incredible for history and Jewish history, what we know happened. And arms shall stand on his part. In other words, he shows his great force. And according to Maccabees, remember Maccabees is not a biblical book, okay? It is an apocryphal book, but it does have a lot of legitimate history in it. And in the Apocrypha, in Second Maccabees, we read he killed 80,000 people in 3 days. Again, just stop and think of that, even in light of our history. What if somebody would attack America or Washington and kill 80,000 people in 3 days? I mean, wow, this is big deal stuff. Okay. Secondly, it says he polluted the sanctuary. We know he offered abominable offerings on the altar, including a swine. So, of course, that is totally non kosher. He forbade the daily sacrifice, and he set up the abomination that makes desolate. Quote I gave you on the sheet to summarize it: it's an abominable act committed against the temple that results in it being desolate or unclean and unusable. So, in other words, he basically just said, I am going to so defile the place that you call the most holy place in Judaism that basically you will just say, okay, we will gladly kiss up to you, we will bow down, we will act like the Greeks, we will turn our back on Judaism. So the sanctuary, the altar are polluted, making it unfit to worship the true God. And of course, we know that this abomination was actually an altar. Some would say it was a statue or an idol to Zeus, Zeus being the chief god of the Greek pantheon. So this is the time, of course, when, as we know from history, it just, should we say, in one sense, really shut down Jewish worship. And of course, it's about 3 years later when, as we'll see in it, where we know, even though this chapter doesn't talk about it, the Jews are going to cleanse the temple, etc. And what is the Jewish feast today that is still celebrated when it was cleansed after about 3 years? Hanukkah. Yeah, okay. So all of this history is fitting right in with contemporary Jewish history, what they still celebrate today, because after about 3.5 years, we'll see the name of the gentleman who led the Jewish forces. They went in, cleansed the temple, and we have Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights. Okay? So, verses 32 to 35, next major paragraph. And such as do wickedly against the covenant, he, that is Antiochus, shall corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil for days. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, to purge them, to make them white, to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. So, as the quote I put on your sheet there, it is made clear that there were two parties among the Jews: those who were determined to remain faithful to the ancestral teaching, and they would have to endure persecution, and the Hellenizers. And again, remember what Hellenization is all about. Hellenization is simply the Greek way of doing everything. And that really began with Alexander when he established, if you will, the Greek Empire. It was a matter of, we need to spread Greek culture all over the world. We need to get people to think like Greeks, to talk like Greeks, to act like Greeks, to simply, as I say, just drink the Greek Kool-Aid. You just be like everybody around you. Don't try and be divisive. And of course, for Antiochus now, as he is trying to unite his empire, it becomes all the more important for him to get everybody, should we say, on the same page. We can't have anybody out of lockstep. We can't have anybody doing their own thing religiously or whatever. We've all got to do the same thing. So, Antiochus' rage that we just saw in verse 31, even though we might think it was only against the temple because he desecrated it and everything, Actually, it wasn't. And it wasn't just against the city of Jerusalem, but his policy was throughout all the cities. Again, let me just read you a couple of quick excerpts from um, the apocryphal book of Maccabees, First Maccabees chapter 1, beginning at verse 13, where it describes this. And remember, the writer of Maccabees is actually looking back on this time period. So he's writing it from a sense of history. That's why this is not a part of the Bible. He says, then certain of the people were so forward that they went to the king, that is, they went to Antiochus, who gave them license to do after the ordinances of the heathen. Whereupon they built a place of exercise at Jerusalem according to the customs of the heathen, and made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, and joined themselves to the heathen, and were sold to do mischief. You notice how many times the word heathen came up? That's just like his passage is telling us. The line was drawn in the sand. Are you going to remain true to the God of the ancestors, to Yahweh, or are you going to become a heathen? And it's interesting that he would mention here that they wanted to build a gym in Jerusalem, and you say, well, what would that have to do with it all? Remember, you exercised in the nude in those days, and so if you were a Jew, you had circumcision performed on you. And so now what's going to happen when you're there in the gym? Everybody's going to say, you're a Jew. All I need to do is look at you and I can tell it. And so we know from history there were people who actually did reverse circumcision so that when they would be seen in the gym, people wouldn't recognize them immediately as being a Jew. Okay? Sounds strange to us, doesn't it? But remember, think of contemporary culture and the way our culture tries to get us to drink today's Kool-Aid and say, be like we are, just act like every other ungodly, unsaved person. You don't want to stick out like a sore thumb that you know Christ. No, no, no. You can't do that. You just have to just walk the walk and talk the talk like everybody else. Well, that's the challenge being put to these Jews. And then a little later in First Maccabees chapter 1, just a couple of excerpts, it says, moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people. Okay, notice that? Unity. And everyone should leave his laws, so all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. Yea, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion, and sacrificed unto idols, and profaned the Sabbath. For the king had sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow the strange laws of the land, and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice drink offerings in the temple. They should profane the Sabbaths and festival days, pollute the sanctuary and holy people, set up altars, groves, chapels to idols, sacrifice swine's flesh, sacrifice unclean beasts. They should leave their children uncircumcised, make their souls abominable. On and on it goes. With this is what Antiochus was telling anybody who was a Jew living here. So it didn't matter if you lived out in the countryside and you say, well, I'm in the backwaters. It really doesn't affect me. It did affect you. Okay? So the line is drawn in the sand between the faithful Jews and the compromising Jews. So, what is the result? Well, let me just interject a little bit here because it doesn't refer to these people by name, but we know who they are. At this moment, God was pleased to raise up a priest by the name of Mattathias. It's not an I, it's an A. Mattathias, who was a priest in Modin, the city of Modin or the town of Modin, about 15 miles north and west of Jerusalem. Okay, so he was the priest there. So as we just read, Antiochus sent his ambassadors to all these cities saying, okay, I want you to get everybody in the surrounding area who is a Jew, and I want them to come and simply worship idols, etc., and do exactly what Antiochus has done in Jerusalem. Well, Mattathias had 5 sons, and Mattathias, in effect, said, no way, Jose. I am not going to submit to you. And so when this messenger found another Jew who was willing to do that on the altar, Mattathias killed that fellow Jew who was willing to offer the sacrifice, and then Mattathias killed the ambassador of Antiochus. That's one of the ways to win friends and influence people. When the politician sends somebody to you and you say, we can get rid of you, good riddance, and killed him. So Mattathias and his 5 sons began what history knows as the Maccabean rebellion, or the Maccabean resistance, or the Maccabean revolt. Okay, Maccabean. And after a few years of the fighting, Mattathias died, and his son who took over is the famous son that we know as Judas Maccabeus. And the word Maccabeus, we've talked about this before. What does that word mean? The hammer. Okay? In other words, Judas the hammerer. Wouldn't you like to meet him in a dark alley when it's a one-on-one fight? That's the fear he wanted to instill within you, and that's the kind of warrior he really was. And when his father died in about 168 or so, or 166, he's actually the one who took over for his father. And so, with the leadership of Judas Maccabeus, we find these Jews are rebelling against Antiochus and his policies. And so that's what we find in the remainder of the verses here. From verses 32 to 35, we find this clash on the one hand between Antiochus IV and his pro-Seleucid followers. In other words, there were plenty of Jews, as we've already seen, who said, well, yeah, I'll buy into Antiochus's policy. So on the one side of the line, you had Jews and Gentiles who were following Antiochus IV. On the other side of the line, you had Mattathias and his 5 sons, specifically Judas, saying, we will fight to the death to keep from capitulating to you and your policies of Hellenization. And so that's what we have going on here. So verse 32, what did we see? It says, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. Again, notice that word flattery that we've seen so often when we're talking about Antiochus IV, we saw in previous weeks. He is indeed a smooth-talking individual. That's exactly what the word means. It means somebody who has a slick tongue, very, very smooth with their words. They could talk you off the shirt of your back, even if you'd already given your shirt to them a day ago. Okay, they are just very, very slick. And that's what he's going to do to these Jews who figure, you know what, maybe we better go along with the pro-Seleucid policy. Maybe we better not stand true to Yahweh. But notice the contrast in the last part of verse 32. But the people that know their God will be strong and they will act. And that is a reference to Mattathias and his followers. That's a reference to these Jews who stood true because they were rightly related to God. Verse 33. They that understand among the people shall instruct many. The point here is that there were godly men, there were godly Jews who basically taught other Jews where the line in the sand really was. Because you can imagine if you're a Jew, it would be so easy to say, but so many of my friends have capitulated to a pro-Seleucid policy, to a Hellenization policy. Well, why isn't that the most commodious thing for me to do? But God in his goodness raised up teachers, instructors, to help these other Jews stand strong and not give in to the party line. So as one writer said, and I didn't put this quote on your sheet, at severe junctures especially, God displays his care and his resources. He now gives to his suffering servants wise men, teachers, to instruct, console, and inspire the faithful. But that didn't mean life was going to be easy, because notice what it says in the last part of verse 33. Yet many will fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, and by spoil. In other words, there would be, and as we know from history, there were a lot of Jewish martyrs. A lot of people who said, I don't care what it costs me. Throw me in the fire. Get the sword and cut off my head. I will be faithful to the true God, no matter what the penalty. Verse 34. And when they shall fall, while these people are being martyred for their faith, they shall be holpen with a little help. And most writers agree that the expression a little help is actually God using Judas and his brothers. God raised them up for that very time in history to help those who wanted to stand true to God and his principles. Then it goes on in verse 34, and it says, "But many shall cleave to them with flatteries." And what it seems to be saying here, this is a little difficult, but it seems to be saying that there were many who actually insincerely joined the resistance movement of Judas simply because they were afraid of, shall we say, the ferociousness of the Maccabean warriors. And we know from history that was really true. There were some people who were Jews who previously had gone with Antiochus. But I mean, you can imagine if you see if you see Judas and some of his brothers drive in your driveway, you see them come to your door and knock on the door, and you know what they're going to ask you: are you for us or are you for them? And he might even have his hammer in his hand. How do you think you're going to respond? Well, I'm for them. Yeah, right. Well, no, I'm for you. Yeah, look, I'm a Jew. Of course I'm a Jew. I'm standing for Yahweh. But in reality, you had no concern for the God of the fathers. You had no concern for Judaism. You only wanted to, you simply took your position because you were afraid you would get killed for it. And so, because we do know that as I said, Judas was a ferocious warrior who was out looking for people, out looking for Jews who capitulated. So you can imagine indeed why it wouldn't be all that hard for you to say, well, yeah, I'm on your side. Of course I'm on your side, even though there's nothing about you that showed you cared about the real God. Okay? So that's verse 34. Verse 35, "And some of them of understanding shall fall." So it's reminding us once again that some of these people who stayed true to God, God didn't say, hey, because you're taking the right side, I'm going to just miraculously deliver you. No, they had to die for it. They fell. But notice what it says. God was using this to try them, to purge them, and to make them white. That is, to purify them. But I love this last expression, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. In other words, there is a limit to what Antiochus could do. He was going to come to his end. He was going to bite the dust because God was in control. God had a reason why he was allowing this to happen to the Jews, and God would bring it to an end at its right time. And we do know from history that then the Jews, of course, as we said, went in and they did cleanse the temple, reinstitute the sacrifices, and so on. And then about a year or two after that, actually, Antiochus was way over here in the east, robbing a temple to try and continue to pay off debts and keep his kingdom afloat, if you will. And he ended up being killed over there in the east. Okay? So there definitely was an end to all of this. Now, as I said when we started this particular section, when we think of Antiochus, who was alive and active here, and when we think of the next paragraph now that's going to be talking about the Antichrist here, I said there are three key things you might want to specifically be watching for. One of them is their character. They do what they do because they are what they are. In other words, they are incredibly evil on the inside, and that naturally comes out in all their activity. And we saw that with Antiochus. We're going to see that writ larger with Antichrist. I said, watch for expressions of their activity, and specifically how they are so slick, all their political maneuvering, all their statecraft, enabling them to do what they do. And number three, expressions concerning the end. We saw at least 3 or 4 just in this one paragraph of about 14 verses where it said, but there is a limit to what Antiochus can do. There is an end to it. There is a stoppage to it. And that's all because God is ordering these things. So as we conclude, last minute or two here, some takeaways I put at the bottom to chew on. First of all, again, and you might say, well, Royce, every week you say this. Did your well, some of you are too young, you don't know what a record player is, but did your record player get stuck? No, it's because this is the theme of the book of Daniel, God's sovereignty over individual lives and over nations, over absolutely everything. And so we see, indeed, this sovereign control of God even over the most prideful, megalomaniacal rulers that the world has known. And let's face it, we've seen plenty of them throughout history. For most of us in our lifetime, if you're in your 50s or 60s, you can think back of some of those Middle Eastern rulers, African rulers, that man, did they live in pomp and circumstance. And when they finally, after all their corruption, and there were coups or whatever, and they were caught, and you think of the pictures when they were caught, hiding in the ground, hiding in sewer tunnels, totally disheveled, all kinds of things. And it's like, wow, who'd have thunk that kind of thing could have ever happened to somebody who was that megalomaniacal? Well, it does, because there's an end to it. And God is reminding us of that here. Number two, God has purposes in what he brings about or allows. And again, sometimes we scratch our heads and say, well, why would God allow this? Why didn't he maybe, rope him in a little sooner? Why didn't he make the chain a little shorter? Well, God is God. He knows what he's doing, and he does have a reason. And finally, the absolute necessity for us to know God so we will have discernment and the spiritual guts to stand for God in perilous times. In other words, God needs to help us on a daily basis to build a good, solid, strong foundation. And if you're saved, you have that foundation in Jesus Christ. But then daily we need to be maturing and building on that foundation so that when the time of pressure comes, in contemporary America, when everything around us constantly shouts, here, drink this contemporary Kool-Aid, be just like the world. We've got to know where is that line in the sand that we say, I will not pass that, because that would make me look like an unsaved person. That would make me look like I'm on the wrong team. And so we need to be growing in our faith so that we have this spiritual guts, this fortitude, this backbone to be able to stand and to stand firmly for the Lord Jesus Christ. So we need to stop there. Any really quick observations, concluding comments, corrections, additions, deletions? Next week we will pick up at 11:36 and finish the chapter, and then, Lord willing, week after that, chapter 12. Well, that's a whole nother ball game. If you read it, you can realize that in places where there's fanciful stuff written, etc., and so forth. But you might want to talk to Dave Simon, because especially his son this last summer was really doing a lot of work on that stuff, and I think Dave looked at some of those books. So Dave will be able to answer any question you have in a minute or less. Sorry to put you on the spot, Dave, but Wilson was here. I should have put Wilson on the spot, right? Yeah. Okay, Lord bless you. About 18 minutes, and we'll have our morning service.